Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. We carry out our work on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We're delighted to share this conversation with Malcolm Gladwell, the best-selling author of Outliers, Talking to Strangers, and The Tipping Point, among other influential works. He joined us to speak with Ian Hanomansing about Revenge of the Tipping Point, his latest book that reframes the lessons of his groundbreaking debut for our confounding new era. This event was recorded live on October 14th, 2024. We'll be releasing tickets next month for our upcoming fall programming, including our flagship October Festival and more special events like this one, so visit our website for more information. The Vancouver Writers Fest would like to thank our public sector funders, without whom we couldn't do our work. They are the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island.
We're going to start the conversation by talking not about a book you've done, but about the last two episodes of your podcast, The Georgetown Massacre. Let's start there. Okay, this is not a surprise question.
Don't make it look like it's a surprise. Where to start?
We
Where to
talked
start?
about this.
I'm inordinately proud of these, as I told you, of these last two. It's in the book, I describe in passing a court case that involved a very rich man named Amin Khoury, who was trying to get his daughter into Georgetown University. And in order to do so, he put $200,000 in a brown paper bag and gave it to the tennis coach at Georgetown. And because, the way that American elite universities work, they reserve special spots just for athletes who play country club sports like rowing and fencing and tennis. And not only do they reserve spots for these athletes, they let them in with way lower academic credentials. So if you're very rich and you want your kid to go to a good school, option number one is to see if they can get in the front door. But if they're also not very bright, then option number two is that you could just give the university like 20 million. But maybe you don't have 20 million, so lying around. So option number three is you give a smaller amount of money as a bribe to a sports coach who will let your kid in the back door that's reserved for country club sports and pretend that you're under the pretense that your child can play sports, when in fact they may not be able to at all. And what was called the Varsity Blues scandal was rich people availing themselves of this back door, paying large sums of money. And the most hilarious, the case broke because there was a kid from a very fancy private school in Los Angeles who was admitted to Tulane University on the grounds that she was an African-American tennis star. And it was discovered, the guidance counselor at her school discovered this fact and alerted the authorities and said, she's neither African-American nor does she play tennis. So the jig was up at that point. And turns out they ended up busting 56 rich people who had pulled this scam.
Malcolm, 56, but 57 had been charged.
Exactly. And my podcast is about the 57th case, which is the one they don't want to talk about. And it was enormously entertaining. And I learned about it. I was on vacation in Boca Raton with my kids, because that's where you go when you have kids. And I learned about this case, and I bought the PDFs of the trial transcripts, which are 2,000 pages. And everything else ceased to matter. I just was riveted by this case.
So anybody who thought it would be really cool to hang out with Malcolm Gladwell
and
go on vacation with him, no. He has 2,000 pages of transcripts.
My kids are like in the lazy river, practically drowning, and I'm just focused on. And I discovered that the attorneys for the defendant, a rich man named Amin Khoury, were in Miami, which is like an hour and a half away. So I called them up and I said, they're the two most famous criminal defense lawyers in America, Roy Black and Howard Shrevenick. And I called them up and I said, you don't know me, but I'm in Boca. I've ordered the transcripts to this case. I'm on page 1750. This is just amazing. And they're like, okay, you can come down. So I went down and hung out with them, and it was, the podcast is all about how they managed. They won. In other words, they got the guy who put the 200 grand in a brown paper bag and bribed the tennis coach. None of those facts are in dispute, and they got him off.
So why are we starting this by talking about that case? Well, first of all, it's a little different than what's in the book and what's in other books that you've done, but also because it kind of opens the door to allow us to talk about a particular kind of storytelling. I mean, with The Tipping Point, 25 years ago, obviously, you nailed that kind of storytelling, this nonfiction book that had insights about how social changes happen, and people embraced it, and as we heard in the introduction, that became part of the language, Tipping Point. But you also now have embraced podcasting, and I don't know, I assume it's a different kind of storytelling.
It's a totally different kind of storytelling, which I didn't realize when I started it. And it's actually changed the way I write my books. Because what happens if you do audio, and you are someone who also has done an awful lot of audio in your life, it's a different animal. And the way people, my friend Charles, who's a screenwriter, always says we think with our eyes and we feel with our ears. It's so much more emotional, so much easier to reach someone emotionally in audio. And it's so much better at character, right? You can bring someone to life. It's weird to think that if you remove the picture, it's so much easier to create a vivid image in the mind of your listener than it is if you can show them a picture, like in a movie or a documentary. And on a page, you can have, there's so much, in a book, there's so much more information than there can possibly be in audio, right? But that information also gets in the way, in this kind of weird way, of the storytelling. And so what I discovered with audio was that it was just this magical way to kind of bring people alive. And that's kind of infected I'm way more interested now in character than I was 25 years ago.
So has it affected your writing of books?
It has. I mean, I'm also much more interested in, I think my last three books have been, which are all written in the kind of podcast era they're much more character and kind of plot driven. They're much more interested in people's emotional responses to things. Audio makes you the thing about audio, which is going to sound like a diss of audio, but you can tell a very slight story in audio. Like you can do something that just, if you tried to write it in a book, it would be like so trivial and weird. You think this should be like a 3-paragraph summary. This isn't a book. You do it in audio though, you can go on for as long as you like, and it's fine. And you can also, people's tolerance for mischief in audio is way higher.
So what do you mean?
Well, a lot of my podcast episodes are just me being mischievous, right? Like, gently making fun of, or not gently, as the case may be, making fun of somebody. I once did we once did a 4-part series of revisionist history on what was wrong with The Little Mermaid. And because it all started because I was reading this law journal and I discovered this brilliant legal scholar at Northwestern University who was watching The Little Mermaid with her kids. And she does contracts. That's her specialty. And you know that The Little Mermaid, the story turns on a contract that The Little Mermaid enters into with Ursula, right?
You're looking at me as if I know this. I do not know this.
You have kids. You never watched The Little Mermaid?
My kids are 28 and 31, so no.
You think The Little Mermaid was invented yesterday?
Oh my God, I can't believe I'm on the spot over The Little Mermaid.
Do you not also have you have a grandchild who's 1? Dude, you are 3 years away from many, many airings of The Little Mermaid.
Okay, Malcolm, can we move on?
But
So
my point
the
is,
Little
all right.
Mermaid turns on a
So
contract.
you're the only person in this entire hall who does not know that The
Apparently.
Little Mermaid turns on a matter of contract law.
Okay.
Ursula forces The Little Mermaid to sign this contract where she basically, if she doesn't win the heart of the handsome prince, she signs over her life in servitude to Ursula, the Wicked Witch, which is in violation of all principles of contract law. You can't, she's a minor to start with. You can't, on and on. So this legal scholar is like watching The Little Mermaid, and she's like, what is going on? My kids are being exposed to a travesty of legal justice. So she writes this brilliant paper for a prominent, prestigious legal journal, which is basically what's wrong with The Little Mermaid. And I read this, and I was like, this is fantastic. So I call her up, and we have this great conversation. And I say, well, so what you're telling me is that this iconic children's fairy tale is fatally flawed. She goes, absolutely. And so I took it upon myself to rewrite it. So I got it. We were originally just going to do 1 episode, and then we did 2, and then we were like, no, we can't do it in 2. Then we did 3, and finally it was 4. And I got a friend of mine who's a screenwriter in Hollywood, Britt Marling, to write this new ending. And we ended up convincing, and this is going to sound like name dropping, and it is name dropping, but it's not really name dropping because I have no idea why they said yes. I got Jodie Foster to play a prominent role in our new performance of the Little Mermaid.
And just pause for a sec. I mean,
Yeah.
I know you live a different life than we all
Yeah.
do, but do you just have her number on your phone?
I don't remember how I got her. I don't remember. The other person I got was Glenn Close. But I have an explanation. I used to live in an apartment building in the West Village, in a little tiny apartment that was like studio. It was like 700 square feet. Glenn Close lived in the penthouse. And I would see her all the time in the elevator. Be like, hey, Glenn. And we sort of became chatty. And then, so years pass, and I still I think maybe she remembers me. So I called up her agent, and I said, can you get a message to Glenn? I really want her to play this role. I've forgotten which role we had her play. And she was like, yes. So we had Jodie Foster, Glenn Close, and then we had Dax Shepard play another role. And Britt Marling played another role. And they were all in this, Glenn Close was on Zoom, and everyone else was in this little studio.
Wow.
And it was just genius. My point is, you can't do that in print. Right?
Yes.
It's just it would be ridiculous and pointless. But you could do 4 episodes on The Little Mermaid.
What are the and I'm not asking you personal questions about finances, but there's so many podcasts out there.
Yeah.
And when I listen to a lot of podcasts, but when I listen to them, I don't raise a finger. They just show up on my phone. I listen. I don't pay anything. I sit there through ads. Is there money to be made in podcasts now?
Sometimes. The people at the very top, and I am not among them, make enormous sums of money. But we make a decent living. We have a podcast company, which we have a bunch of podcasts. You can you can get a large enough audience, and advertisers will support it. It works.
So that's a resounding yes. There's a huge amount of money in successful podcasts.
But no. But this is revisionist history. Is not Joe Rogan. I mean, it's not like.
In many ways.
Yes. No. It's not like. We don't. And we. And never. And it never will be. We're too ornery to get a really, really, really large audience.
It's a fantastic form of storytelling. You do it very well as a consumer. I grew up loving radio, listening a lot to radio, work still in radio, so, continue to listen to it. But love the fact that I can listen to so many podcasts, and I've added yours as I researched tonight, and also we did an interview earlier for The National. Started listening to your podcast as well. I hadn't before. It's fantastic. But as I listen to it, I think to myself, it sounds like you do it on a whim, but how do you decide what the topics are? It
is very whimsical. I did these things always start out as one episode and they end up being. So my friend Ben, who I work with, we wanted to do something on the 1936 Olympics this summer. And so we were initially going to do 2 episodes and we ended up doing 9. And we wandered off. We almost immediately wander off topic. In fact, we spent almost no time whatsoever on the 1936 Olympics, which is, again, you can do that. It became, I mean, it's serious in parts, but it becomes a kind of lark. Basically, what we discovered was that the Olympic movement, so the question, the whole podcast was about, why did the world go to the Olympics in 1936 when the Olympics were in Nazi Germany, right? And Hitler had already kind of revealed himself to be a very, very, very bad dude. But everybody showed up. Why? And so the story is, in large part, the result of it. The answer is that there was a series of people, mostly Americans, who were essentially Hitler lovers. And they were all very, very rich, middle-aged white men, and also profoundly stupid. And one of them, this guy named Charles Sherrill, who we just could not get enough of Charles Sherrill, he had the misfortune to die in 1936 after the Olympics. Now, the reason that's important is that everyone else who loved Hitler and who died after the war cleansed their personal papers of any evidence that they loved Hitler. So we don't know who they were. All these famous people, they donate their papers to Yale University upon their death in 1951, and there's a big gap between 1934 and 19... Charles Sherrill dies in 36, and his widow forgets to clean up his papers. So we go to his papers, which are being at the New York Historical Society, and it's all there, including he goes and meets with Hitler twice, and he's just it's like a love letter. I mean, it's almost as bad, by the way, as, although not quite, as Mackenzie King.
We were all wondering how that sentence was going to end. and most of us didn't think it was going to be Mackenzie King.
Mackenzie, no one loved Hitler more than Mackenzie King.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Oh, my God. Mackenzie King has this letter with his diary entry on meeting Hitler.
Wow.
Is he goes on and on and on about how Mackenzie King actually has a line in which he says that Hitler's greatest trait appears to be his love of small children, and his lasting contribution to Germany will be his desire to restore the gardens of Germany to their... He meets Hitler and he thinks he's this guy who is into kids and flowers. I mean, he's Mackenzie King from my hometown, from Kitchener-Waterloo. You would think that someone who was the dominant Canadian politician of the 20th century would have a lick of sense about Hitler. None. He's going there in, I think he goes there in, someone may correct me if I'm wrong, in 37 or 38, when the writing is on the wall. I mean, it's not, and he's just going on about children and small animals and how this man is just delightful, and he's awfully proud to be. It's kind of weird. So there is this kind of, anyway, we get off on this.
I can't imagine how you ended up doing 7 episodes on this.
Yeah, no, it seems remarkable, doesn't it? But I mean, Ben and I, we got, at one point we went on some field trip to northern Alabama. It was really fun because I convinced Ben that we had to do a whole episode on something that happened in northern Alabama that was kind of oddly relevant to our topic.
Well, that's a good tease.
Yes.
I want to get back. Now, people are saying this is the Writers' Festival. Let's talk a little bit about books. We will.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask you one other thing about the Georgetown Massacre, the 3 episodes, I think, or 2 episodes.
2 episodes. Could have been more.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
And it's how that story, the fact that when you read through that transcript on your wacky vacation in Florida, that you may have been the first journalist to read those transcripts, and that as a former Washington Post journalist, you kind of lament the fact that as newsrooms in the United States shrink, as local newspapers close down, and we have a sense of what that's like here in Canada, there are fewer and fewer reporters doing the kind of work in the journalistic trenches that they used to. And so stories like that person who had been charged in the Varsity Blues case get untold unless a podcaster stumbles upon it.
Yeah, so this story, which is an exceedingly rich man bribes his daughter's way into Georgetown, it goes to trial for 2 weeks, during which the inner workings of Georgetown University are completely exposed, and the guy gets off in the end. That story 25 years ago would have been covered by every major network, 6 or 7 newspapers. It was in Boston. It would have been all over the Boston press. We would all have known about it, and my job as a journalist would have been to extract some new lesson from it. So I discover this, I hear about this case and think, let me learn about it. I go online and I discover that not a single thing has been written about this case, with one exception. The Associated Press wrote a very, very short paper upon the verdict. And I called up the AP reporter and said, you're the only person who seems to have attended this trial. And the reporter said, I didn't go to the trial. I'm in New York. I just got a press release and rewrote it. That's it.
Wow.
And that's like, part of the story was a lark, but this part is not a lark. This part was alarming to me. Because I was, I grew up, and you did too, in an era when newspapers and when local news in particular was a real thing, right? And you had some confidence that if something of significance happened, someone would shine a light on it. I now have no confidence that if something of significance happens. When I think back to the Washington Post is a good example, a paper that is today a shadow of its former self. But when I was there in its heyday, we had over 1,000 reporters. So I was assigned, my beat was this tiny, tiny slice of the Washington health policy establishment. And there were things that happened that I didn't know about it, but very few. Every single day I was on the phone with senior people in government agencies figuring out what was going to happen that day. And so were dozens and dozens of my colleagues. That's all gone. And I'm quite sure there's a similar kind of thing going on. And multiply that out by local governments, that's gone. I don't think democracies can continue to function in the absence of some transparency over what's being done, right? Because if you were an elected official in 1988 or 1992, even if someone didn't write about what you did, you lived under the expectation that someone was going to find out, not in a nasty way, but somebody would alert the world to what you were doing. Now,
no, it's absolutely true. It's true here, and that work in the trenches at city council and school board in small cities and towns across Canada often isn't getting done because newsrooms have been decimated. Let's enjoy the nostalgia for a moment. You were in the Washington Post newsroom in 1987, 88? And from where you were sitting, you could see some of the greatest reporters.
Bob Woodward was right
That's
there.
crazy.
Yeah.
So you would have been 25 years old and
22
and just feet away from Bob Woodward. What was that like?
Well, to this day, I don't know why they hired me. I've never figured that out because I had never written a newspaper story before. And I have various theories. I think it's possible they confused me with someone else. But I got this job and I didn't know what to do. And I was like 22 or 23. And my first 6 months, I just kind of sat in this chair. And Woodward, the greatest investigative reporter of his generation, was, like I said, not even 10 feet over there. And I could basically hear what he was doing. And so I just sat there and listened to him. And it was this kind of masterclass. I couldn't understand what was going on, but I could see, you understood that the hardest working person in the entire place was the most famous person.
Wow.
And all around me were these extraordinary reporters. I just kind of sat there and I occasionally, the first article I wrote for the Washington Post, I was a business story about this local company, and I misread their financial statement, and I said that they had lost $5 million in the previous quarter when they had made $5 million in the quarter. And that I survived that, you can imagine what the owner of that company said to the owner of the Washington Post. But I did survive long enough to learn what I was doing, fortunately.
25 years ago, The Tipping Point comes out. What was your life like 26 years ago?
Well, I was working for the New Yorker. I was living in a walk-up on Bank Street. Bank Street is a street now a fancy street, back then not a fancy street, in the West Village. I was on the 6th floor of a 6th-floor walk-up, and my apartment was about the size of this rug. But I loved, and I thought, I won't go, it's too complicated, but I figured out a way. There were no apartments to be had in New York back then. There was a huge housing shortage. And so I wrote a story for New York Magazine on New York's rent control laws, in large part to figure out how to game the system and get an apartment. And I figured out how to do it. So I got like 1,200 people or something applied for my apartment, and I got it myself. I was enormously pleased with myself. And I was just writing. It was like heyday of the New Yorker. It was like Tina Brown was the editor. There was like, you could sort of do what you wanted. And when I was at the Washington Post, everybody was incredibly productive. But my whole strategy back then was always that you should always be doing at a job the thing that no one else is doing, right? So at the Washington Post, everybody was incredibly productive. So I thought the way to be noticed was to not be productive, which turned out to be totally true. And then at the New Yorker, I realized nobody was productive. And so the way to be noticed was to be productive. So I changed overnight. I was so kind of laid back and lazy at the Washington Post. And then at the New Yorker, I was like, all right, this is it. Boom. And so I just started to work really hard. And they were so astonished that someone could write more than one story every 6 months that I kind of made a little, I got noticed.
And then as The Tipping Point began to become this phenomenon, I just wonder what it's like to be on that ride. At what point did it change your life in a significant way?
Well, it doesn't. So the book I started the New Yorker in 1996. The book comes out in 2000, but the book doesn't become a big success until 2004. Forget this. It didn't do very well in the beginning. It only did well when my next book came out. And in the ensuing 4 years, I basically just toured nonstop. I just did one book event after another for years. And I think I kind of, and then when my second book came out, I think people went back and got the first one. So it wasn't this kind of overnight thing. It didn't feel, I mean, it did have eventually kind of made a splash, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like I was hand selling it for years.
There are significant benchmarks, I think, as careers ascend. One of them, I guess, is when Glenn Close will actually return your calls.
Yes. She remembered me from the elevator.
How could she not?
You know that she's like this big. And she's one of these people who, if you see her in person, she is so astonishingly beautiful in a way that you don't realize on the screen. And I just remember I would see her in the elevator. She'd come in, she's got a very large head. And I just would be speechless at how beautiful she was. I just was like.
So then she clearly remembered that guy who had that look on his face.
No, she was in New York. She read the New Yorker. So she would say, "Oh, you Malcolm, you write for the New Yorker?" I would, yes.
And another benchmark, I've heard you talk about this, with The Tipping Point, was when a president, Clinton, used The Tipping Point in context on the air, and you thought, hey man, he's talking about my book.
Yeah, that was a fun moment. Yeah, I've never met Bill Clinton, but he did say that nice thing about me, and I have repeated it many times, as you can imagine. It might put that on my I recently, the president who I have met is Obama. And I interviewed him. I met him a couple times, but I interviewed him recently. And the same event, George Bush was there. And watching them interact was the most hilarious thing I've ever seen. Because they're like, you realize they're like you'd think that they be all kind of chummy and they're sort of not. They're kind of deeply competitive in a sort of hilarious, and you just realize, oh, it's just like, it's like they're two hockey coaches in some small town in Canada. It's not any different than that. Only they were running the biggest country in the world.
Yeah, I mean, this was like a wine and cheese. How did two presidents compete at this?
No, it was a history Channel event in LA, and they invited a bunch of presidents.
Wow.
And I don't know, I'm, it's a long story. Anyway, I got invited to ask him. But of course, and if you've ever seen Obama interviewed, the person asking the questions, it's, you ask one question and you're done. Like, he doesn't need anyone to ask him questions.
Yeah.
He's fine.
Do you get starstruck at all?
Not around. I was a runner when I was a kid, and I used to get incredibly nervous before races. So nervous that I've never gotten nervous around anything else again. It cured me of ever being nervous. I just think back, is this as bad as when I was 15 and I was, running in the whatever, 1,500 meters? It's like not as bad. So I don't. And to this day, I started running again, and it all came back, like the nerves. And I would be like, running in a turkey trot or something, some random 5K, on the weekend and I would, I'd wake up in a cold sweat at 2 a.m, like, oh my God, I've got a turkey trot tomorrow. But that has this paradoxical effect of making everything else in life seem super easy.
I've talked to musicians before who have a big hit single or album, and then they talk about the pressure of having the second big hit or album and the label coming to them and saying, okay, you need to do this all over again. Did you go through periods like that where you felt pressure from publishers to make another tipping point? Or could you just basically kind of write your own or figure out your own path and write what you wanted when you wanted?
There's a difference. So musicians, like actors go into acting because they want to be famous actors, right? Very few of them, like the ones, I'm talking about the ones who go to Hollywood to make it in Hollywood. They don't go there because they're interested in the art of acting. If they feel that way, then they do theater or whatever. If you go to Hollywood, you want to get famous. So when you get famous, you're like, that's what I wanted. And if you don't get famous, you're bummed. I think a lot of musicians, young, rock musicians, they want to be the Rolling Stones. They don't want to just play. But I don't think, writers aren't that way. It never occurred to me when I started writing that I would ever get well-known or make any money. That was just not on there's all kinds, there were 10 other reasons why I wanted to be a writer that had nothing to do with that. So it's never seemed like, you're describing the kind of feeling you would have if you were someone whose expectation was to have a hit single. But my expectation was never to have a best-selling book.
But I'm just wondering, when you did have that hit single, so the tipping point as a phrase, as a concept, as something that people looked at as a way of understanding the world, I wonder if you felt, I got to come up with something else like that. You did at least once with the 10,000 hours. I mean, that also became something that I just heard so many people talk about that and say, not only did it help them understand how they got to the point of being an expert, but also that it was prescriptive, that they would tell other people, you really want to learn how to do this properly, you got to put in their 10,000 hours. So I just wonder if when that happened, you thought to yourself, thank God, I've got my second hit single.
No, it's funny. I don't remember any of this.
You remember you wrote that, right?
I do remember I wrote this. I've never thought of my job is very, very, very low stakes. It's exceedingly low stakes.
Wow.
It's basically, and by the way, yours is too. Like, we're not.
How did this turn into something about me? So
no, because I
don't understand The Little Mermaid. I get
no, that was egregious.
I didn't know about Mackenzie King loving Hitler. But now, oh yeah,
You're a
and
Canadian.
my job is low stakes. Okay, fine, whatever.
No, it's low stakes. I mean, let's be honest. It's not high stakes.
At least you didn't say, although it's true, that I am unusually short with a big head.
I think my head's bigger than yours.
Anyway, you were saying, Malcolm?
No, our job is low stakes. My job at its core is what? I call up someone and I say, can I come and talk to you? And they say, yes or no. And if they say yes, I come and I put a tape recorder on the table and I press play and, whatever, an hour and a half or 2 hours later, I leave. That's my job, right? Sometimes I do it on the phone. Sometimes I do it on Zoom. Sometimes I go and see them. And then, an AI thing transcribes the tape for me in 10 seconds. And then I write it up. That's my job. Like, no one's under threat of dying in that process. No angry parent is screaming at me. No, I'm not like wrestling someone to the ground in an arrest like a police officer. It's like, it is so I can't conceive of anything I do representing a disappointment, because it all seems like it's just, I talk to someone and they're boring? That's as bad as it gets. And I come home and I say, but then if they're boring, usually it's your fault. So you think, oh yeah, because I made that mistake.
So you didn't open up the New York Times bestseller list and kind of go, oh, fantastic.
No.
I mean, how can you answer that question? Yes. Like, you can't do that. So
now you're putting words into my mouth.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Going back
Backstage,
he
told me that he opened. No, he didn't. So people have probably heard you talk about the broken windows theory from Tipping Point and how you made a mistake, right? And so, and if you haven't heard that, the story is widely out there. You can talk about it if you want, but I thought we can kind of assume most people have heard you talk about that. I wonder if there's any other major thing that you've written that you either have stepped back from or that people misunderstood.
Well, those are two very different categories.
Yeah. Well, let's do the first one first.
Let's do the mistakes.
You've stepped back from what you wrote about the broken windows theory.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you've kind of stepped back from? Because you are very open about, hopefully 25 years after you write something, we all hopefully have different views of the world, and some things are going to be wrong that we said or wrote before.
So years ago, I wrote a piece for the New Yorker about a woman named Susan Love. Susan Love was someone who believed very strongly that hormone replacement therapy for postmenopausal women was, the evidence supporting it was very weak, and some evidence suggested that there were real problems with this as a widespread practice for women. At the time she was saying that, the medical establishment was 99.9% in disagreement with her. Everyone thought she was an idiot. What's she talking about? Blah, blah, blah. And everyone, the kind of pressure was, that's ridiculous. Take all this estrogen, et cetera, et cetera. And I did a piece about her for the New Yorker. And I towed that line. I said, I didn't make fun of her, but I was basically like, it was a little eye-rolling. Here she is, off on her island, right, kind of thing. Now, if those of you know, she turns out to be 100% correct. And the medical establishment was totally wrong because they hadn't done the work. They hadn't actually done the kinds of studies that would definitively answer whether HRT was good or bad or when it was good or bad. And that was in retrospect, hugely embarrassing story. And it was important for me because and it's in the same way that chapter in A Tipping Point was embarrassing. It reminded me of the kinds of mistakes that I am prone to. Journalists are generally, but me specifically, which is one, not to appropriately hedge a conclusion, right? It's very important to communicate to your audience when you're writing about science, particularly and science is by nature uncertain. You have to communicate that uncertainty. You have to say, and I always say, every sentence should end with, any kind of statement should end with, this is what I think now, or what they think now. What they believe now. Mm-hmm. First key word is believe. We don't know, we believe this at the moment. And second word is now. It could change tomorrow, right? And it took me a very long time as a journalist to understand the importance of the I believe now phrase. And there's a way to have done that story and have said, this woman is off on an island saying things that no one believes. But let's take a critical look at the evidence that the other side is using. And let's entertain the possibility that she might be right. That's the right way to do that story. And that's what journalists should do. And if she is a massive kind of underdog in that world and saying things that seem a little crazy, you have to dignify her position. Now, I say that even if you should dignify her position, even if she is crazy in the end, right? I do think one thing that journalists, it is part of our job to look at ideas that are outside the mainstream and give them the time of day. Not say this is true and everything else is wrong, but just give them the time of day. Like give them, sort of entertain the possibility there might be something to that. It took me 30 years to learn that lesson as a journalist.
So the second version of the question, and you quite rightly point out is different, but something that people have misquoted you on or misunderstood, or you've seen somebody, adopt something that they say, well, this is what Malcolm Gladwell wrote or proved. Has there been a moment where you've kind of cringed and thought,
oh, yeah.
don't say that?
Well, there was something, the 10,000 hours thing, which, almost nothing in the way that idea is talked about actually comes to my book. It was like, to the point, the absurdity that was said in the name of 10,000 hours makes me roll my eyes. But the big one was in that same book, I had that whole thing about the importance of birth month in succeeding in hockey. Mm-hmm. And, over the years, like hundreds of parents that come up to me and said, I read that and I held my kid back and that's the best thing I ever did. And
or conceive the kid in a different month in order to make sure.
It's gotten so bad that I was chatting with some people at this very fancy private school that's not far from my house called Hotchkiss. And at Hotchkiss, the parents whose kids were the youngest in their class held their kids back a year so they could be the oldest in their class. Whereupon the parents of the kids who had once been the eldest in their class and were now the youngest held their kids back a year. Whereupon the kids who had once been the youngest and then were the oldest and then were the youngest again held their kids back. And literally kids from Hotchkiss were graduating from high school at 20.
And hang on a sec. That's a punchline, right? That's not true. Is it true?
That's true.
Really?
Oh, and no, the punchline was, it was an open question whether kids would graduate ever, since this could go on, indefinitely. And the whole point of that chapter was that being the youngest, if you're thinking about this in academic terms, the people for whom this is an issue are people for whom they already have 3 strikes against them. Single parent home, low income, disadvantaged, have another learning disability. If you've got those 3 strikes against you and you are also the youngest in your class, that's a problem. And the school should recognize that and make sure you at least have the benefit of maturity in your class. Mm-hmm. Hold you back a year or put you in a class with other kids who are similarly. That's what that was about. It wasn't for the children of upper middle class parents who already have every advantage in the world to game the system so they have another advantage. They just turned it into an arms race. And the other thing that drove me crazy was that wasn't intended for parents, it was intended for schools, right? You're the principal of an elementary school and you've got 3 grade 1 classrooms, arrange them by birth month. Like put the January, February, March kids in one class and the April, May, June, July kids in another, and just at least limit the extent to which those maturity biases affect your assessment of performance. And they don't do that, which drives me crazy. And by the way, to this day, the Canadian, if you look, I was looking at the Canadian junior hockey team. It is still 30 years after this Canadian psychologist identified this problem, mm-hmm. that they basically just picked January, February, March kids for elite hockey in this country. The hockey establishment has not fixed the problem. It's still January, February, March kids. How dumb is this? It makes me want to throttle these people. It's their job to find talented hockey players. And by the way, all around the world now, junior sports programs have figured this out and are making changes. So there's all kinds of really clever things you can do. One of the things, for example, in English squash.
You read too much.
I do read a lot. No, I'm very obsessed with this. So one way you can do it is you have the kids in age class sports move up to the next level on their birthday. It's genius, right? So that every kid, if you think about this, your kid's playing in a age class sport. If you always move up one age level, level on your birthday, it means that every kid will successively have a period of time where they are the youngest in their cohort, when they are squarely in the middle of their cohort, and when they are the eldest in their cohort. That's a beautiful way to solve the problem. In Australian swimming, they give you a battery of tests and they assess your relative maturity, and they have a bunch of kids will swim the 100-meter freestyle. They have two ways of registering the results of the race. The first is the order of finish, and the second is the maturity-adjusted order of finish. And they're different. So you can come in last in the order of finish, but then it turns out that, you're the youngest 13-year-old in the race, and also you're immature for your age, and if you do the adjustment, you're actually the fastest kid in the race. That's beautiful. So that kid who used to be last doesn't get discouraged and quit, and sticks around, and they end up having a much larger talent pool. They could do this in Canadian hockey, and they don't do it. And it drives me bananas.
Well, one of the problems with hockey, and I first read about this actually not in your book, but Ken Dryden wrote about this.
Yeah.
And he talked, the problem is that when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, the kids who are born in January, February, March are older and on average bigger, and they tend to make these teams. But then the bias continues in their favor. And then in hockey, the draft is at 18. So one of the things that Dryden wrote is, according to the study apparently, if you look at football players who generally are chosen by their professional teams at 21 or 22, that it is much more evenly distributed around
Also,
the
they
calendar.
don't have traveling football squads for 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you avoid this problem.
We're going to take your questions. It's on the iPad here in about 5 or 10 minutes. Before we get there, let's get to Revenge of the Tipping Point. There's so much I can ask you about, and I'm going to ask you in a moment what you'd like to talk about in that book. But before, there's been a thread that has run through this conversation so far. And when I interviewed you earlier today for The National, it'll be on a couple of Sundays from now, your eyes, your whole demeanor lit up when we talked about Harvard, and we talked about affirmative action at Harvard, and a kind of affirmative action at Harvard that most people probably don't realize is happening. And it has to do with your favorite cohort, which is rich people playing sports like rowing and tennis and all the reasons why your two young kids will probably never go to Harvard.
What's sad about that little statement you said is that I do have two small children, and what you really want to hear is, and your face lit up when you talked about your two young children. But that's not what you said. You said your face lit up when you talked about how much you hate Harvard. And I just thought, that is just about the most damning thing anyone's ever said about me.
Well, we're done.
Your kids, hey, no, apparently that's not.
Apparently not.
Work up a lather about elite school.
So let's talk about Harvard.
Yeah. Well, I have a long-standing aversion. As anyone who listens to my podcast knows, I've been making fun of them for many years of elite schools. And I like to come up with new ways of making fun of them. And in my book, I have a whole chapter, which is, I think, one of my more imaginative punching ups that I've ever done, in which I just pointed out, that it's foreign to us as Canadians, but in America, these fancy schools, all the Ivy League schools, they have a back door for athletes. And the back door says that we're going to reserve, by the way, Harvard, first thing you should know is that at Harvard University, they play more varsity sports than any other university in the United States. There are more student athletes at Harvard than any other university in the United States. They're obsessed with sports. And they reserve, so if you've got like 30 people on your 2 rowing teams, they reserve 30 admission slots for rowers. And then on top of that, they say, and if you are a recruited rower, your admission standard for getting in is like way lower, way, way, way lower. And if you look at the sports majority of the sports they're playing, it's not basketball and football. It's rowing, tennis, fencing, sailing.
What are you saying, Malcolm?
Yeah, you get the picture, right?
Yeah.
So they have permanently reserved an enormous number of admissions slots for which they are giving an enormous admissions preference for sports that are entirely played by rich kids in country clubs, right? What's that about, right? Meanwhile, there's been this raging controversy in America about affirmative action for kids who are from disadvantaged communities. And that was so egregious and outrageous that the Supreme Court last year declared it unconstitutional. And it's not okay to give a special break at admissions to kids who come from poor backgrounds. But apparently it is okay to give a special break for kids who are tennis players and rowers and fencers and sailors. Sailing gets you into the back door at Harvard. Like, this is the most preposterous thing I've ever heard.
You know what? This is Vancouver, so be careful.
Yeah, it's true. No one in this room, I'm not saying sailing's a bad thing to do. No one loves sailing. I mean, I don't sail, but I'm quite sure if I went out on a sailboat with someone in this room, I would have a grand time, right? And I would remark in the course of this sailing around the bay, I would remark at the skill at which this sailboat was being manipulated, right? But we can all agree on sailing's a wonderful thing. It takes skill. But no one would think that because you're so good at sailing, I'm going to give you a special admissions break when you apply to Harvard. Like, whose idea was that? That's crazy, right? That's not the way. So this is like this. That's the kind of the bridge too far element of this.
Let's talk about something else in your book. There's so many things I could ask you about, but why don't you kind of choose one that the people here who haven't yet read your book might find interesting. And while you do that, I'm going to look through the iPad. Whether it's Overstory or The Magic Third, why don't you tell us something about from this book that will become the next 10,000 hours?
Yeah. How much time do you need to go through those things? Just so I know how long I should go on.
Give me 90 seconds.
Okay. All right. Well, now this is the freestyle portion of the evening. Apparently, I can do whatever I want. I have many fun chapters. One fun chapter is about the bank robbery epidemic in Los Angeles in 1991. Two members of the Crips gang, known as Casper and Sea-Dog, got it in their heads in 1990 that what they really should be doing instead of selling crack was robbing banks. And they set off the greatest bank robbery spree in the history of the United States. They personally, in the course of a year and a half, robbed 175 banks, which is a lot of banks. And they inspired so many others that bank robberies in America in the late 90s like go up like that. And they're almost all in Los Angeles. There's so many bank robberies in Los Angeles. There are days when there's like 6 or 7 or 8 in a day. And if you know LA, you know that they have a problem with traffic. So the FBI, it's a federal crime, so it has to be investigated by the FBI. So it'd be like, at like 10:30, they get called to a bank robbery, wherever, somewhere downtown. They would go there and they would start interviewing witnesses. And then they would get a call, oh, another bank robbery. And they would get in their car and they would get stuck in traffic. And so they would get to that one late. And then by the time they got there, there'd be another bank robbery. And they were always like hours behind the bank robbers because of traffic. Because it's just one group of FBI guys who were responsible for all of the bank robberies. Anyway, this goes on for a year and a half, and Casper and Sea-Dog get increasingly bold. And their innovation is the way you rob that many banks is you don't do it yourself. You outsource it. So they would go to local high schools and they would convince kids to come, and they would give them semi-automatic weapons, and they would send them into the banks. And they would, at one point, they stole a school bus, and they would load the kids onto the school bus, and then they would follow the school, because they didn't want the school bus out of their sight, obviously. They would be parked down the street, and they would just follow the school bus back to their hideout and like take the cash and send the kids home. It's really a remarkable. They just got out of prison this past summer, and I learned this, and I called them up, and I said, I would love to talk to you guys more about this. And literally, this is what I said. They said, well, we've already sold the film rights to Leo DiCaprio. So I was like, oh, Leo beat me to the punch.
Wow.
With Casper and Sea-Dog. But that's what it means to be a bank. I don't think that happens necessarily if you're a famous bank robber in Toronto or Vancouver.
And maybe you did mention this while I was looking through the iPad, but that was an example, I think, of one of the theories that you talk about, overstory, and was it? And that in Los Angeles, the sort of the idea of robbing banks became this thing that seems...
It's local. So
Yeah.
I got really interested in the book by the idea that epidemics, we think about epidemics of disease as being borderless. They don't respect, they go everywhere, right? COVID goes everywhere. But epidemics, of ideas and behavior are marked by, really do respect borders. That you could have epidemics that never cross the boundary of a city or a town. And I go in some depth about why that would be true. So the LA bank robbery epidemic never goes anywhere else. It's just LA. There's no corresponding bank robbery epidemic in San Diego or San Francisco or any other city in California, which is really weird when you think about it, right? These guys are driving around, pioneering a new technique and, commandeering school buses. And it only works in LA. So I think I begin that book because I think it's a real puzzle as to why something very contagious wouldn't be contagious outside the boundaries of a given community.
One of the things I've learned in asking questions is I try not to ask the superlative question about best or most or whatever.
Yeah.
So you don't have to answer in terms of most, but just one of them. But the question is, tell us about the most interesting person you've encountered. Present company
Ever.
accepted.
Glad you said president. I was going to say you, Ian.
Yeah,
You know that.
I know.
Most interesting?
Yeah.
Well, before I answer this question, I'm going to mildly object to the question.
Okay.
Because I think there's a bias in that question, which is that there's a thing called interestingness, which is apart from the way I would say is that there are interesting stories that people tell. Most people can tell interesting stories, particularly if you know what to ask them and you give them the time to express themselves. That's what interestingness is to me. I don't think of it as this thing. There isn't a person who just is interesting. No, people who we think of as interesting can be crashing bores sometimes. Just all of us are that way. So I guess I would say, what is the most interesting story? I did a podcast episode once I was reading this paper in a criminology journal from like 30 years ago, and there was a footnote. And the footnote was so crazy that I was like, oh my God. Because basically the academic paper was about this phenomenon where the guy who wrote the paper was trying to say, if you murder someone, if you shoot someone, whether or not you are a murderer is a function of two things. One is, the severity of the gunshot or the severity of the stabbing. And the second thing is their access to healthcare. If I shoot you in front of Vancouver General Hospital and they just immediately wheel you into the ER, you'll probably survive, and I'm not a murderer. If I shoot you way, way in the middle of internal BC, miles from anywhere, same shot, and it takes you 3 hours to get to the ER, I'm a murderer, right? So where I shoot you is as important as, right? You're nodding.
Well, again, you're staring right into my eyes.
Well, I'm trying to make this experience real to you, Ian.
It's real.
Okay, good.
So location,
Yeah.
yes.
So this guy does his paper on people on death row in Alabama, and he wants to make the point that since black people in Alabama tend to live in neighborhoods that are far from trauma centers and hospitals, a far higher percentage of black people who shoot people are murderers than white people who shoot people are murderers, right? It's actually incredibly obvious observation, but no one had made it before. So he writes this paper in this obscure journal in like the 1990s, and then he has a footnote at the end where he says, and by the way, this lesson was powerfully brought home to me in my own life when a young man was murdered in my home, period. I'm like, wait, what? So I was like, holy mackerel. So I call the guy up, and he wrote the paper in the 90s. He's now like 90 years old, and he lives in southern Alabama in an old plantation house. I'm like, I just read this paper. He goes, oh, yes, paper. I was like, put the footnote. And he goes, oh, yeah, the footnote. I was like, can I come and see you? So I immediately, your immediate thought is, when you hear the guy's 90, is you got to get down there. So I go down fly to Atlanta, drive straight to, he lives in what's called the Black Belt of Alabama, which is where all the slave plantations used to be. And it's like something out of a Gothic novel. This guy's living in his tumble-down old plantation house, like down some, long, windy gravel driveway overgrown with, wisteria and whatever. And he's this giant guy, like hobbling along, houses falling down around him. There's these giant dogs everywhere. And he tells me this story, which is so unbelievable, that he had been in he and his wife used to take in essentially street kids in Montgomery, Alabama. And they took in a street kid, and the street kid became very close friends with their daughter. And they used to the street kid wanted to leave gangs. And so he said, can I stay in your house in the countryside? And the guy said, sure. And so he went there. The street kid was there and the gang members who he had found out he was there and got in a car and drove 50 miles into the countryside, shot him like 4 times. And they called the ambulance, and the ambulance didn't come, even though the ambulance was the hospital was 7 miles away. They waited for an hour and a half, and the kid died. And this guy, when the ambulance finally shows up, said, you're 7 miles away, and it took you an hour and a half to get here. Why? This kid's dead. And the guy said, we thought he was black. That is an interesting story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was just so insanely and he's, he clearly did that study because of what had happened to him, but he didn't know how to write a paper for a criminology journal where he just tells that story. So he just puts it in a footnote and just hopes someone sees it. And I don't think anyone had ever seen it until I always read footnotes. And I think he'd been waiting for 30 years for someone to call him up to tell that story.
There's so much to celebrate about your work, but curiosity and storytelling, reading footnotes, making the phone call, being able to tell us about it, and then having the audience just gasp when at just the right moment you had the sort of climax of that story are all the things that make what you do so fascinating, whether it's in books or now in podcasts, and occasionally, if we're lucky enough, on stage. And so thank you very much for this conversation. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers' Fest. To hear more events like this one and view our upcoming events, visit our website at writersfest.bc.ca.